Hello and welcome to an introduction to programming using Visual Basic exercises for beginners. In this exercise we are going to simulate a bank account. We are to write a program to maintain a person's savings and checking accounts. The program should keep track of and display the balances in both accounts and maintain a list of transactions, deposits, withdrawals, fund transfers and check clearing. This should be all done separately for each account. The two lists of transactions should be stored in text files. The program should use two classes, transaction and account. The class transaction should have properties for transaction name, amount, date, and whether it is a credit or a deposit or a debit, which is withdrawal. The class account, which will have both checking and savings accounts as instances, should use an array of transaction objects. In addition, it should have properties for name, checking or savings, and balance. It should have methods to carry out a transaction, if possible, and to load the set of transactions from a text file. The events, insufficient funds, and transaction committed should be raised at appropriate times. So here is our form. So we have two drop-down combo boxes, which should have each contain items checking and savings. Each of the four group boxes correspond to a type of transaction. When savings is selected in an account combo box, then the check group box should disappear. The user makes a transaction by entering data into the text boxes of a group box and pressing the associated button. The items appearing in the data grid view control should correspond to the type of account that has been selected. The caption of the second label in the transfer group box should toggle between to checking and to savings, depending on the item selected in the transfer from in the combo box. If a transaction cannot be carried out, a message should be displayed. Two text files should be maintained, one for each account type, and should be updated each time a transaction is carried out. So I'm in Visual Studio 2015. Let's start coding. Here's my form, as you can see, just like you saw in the slide. And here's the two text files, checking and savings. And they have the same structure. They have the date of the transaction, the type of transaction, like deposit, transfer from savings, and so forth, the amount of the transaction, and true or false, depending whether the transaction was typed credit or a debit. Now in my form, when it says account, which is a drop-down, if I go to it, you'll see that I have the checking and savings. And from the transaction in the transfer group box, I have again the checking and savings. So we'll be transferring from one to the other account. Alright, so let's create those two classes. The classes should be account and transaction. So I have my account and transaction. They're blank for now. Alright, the first class, let's do the transaction. It has four parts. It has the name of the account, whether it's savings or checking. It has the amount, the date, and whether it is credit or debit. So I will create private variables for those. Each of these can have a read-only property that will retrieve the information. So I'll do the name first. And this property will retrieve the name from our getter. So our get will return the name. And similarly, I'll do the amount, transaction date, and credit read-only properties that will retrieve the amount, the date, and credit that are set in our private variables. Alright, so I have my four private variables and the way to retrieve the information from them in our read-only properties. So now I can do the constructor for the transaction. And the constructor will obviously need these properties set by the user. So we will pass them as the argument. So you pass date as date, we will pass name as string, we will pass amount as double, and we will also pass credit as boolean. So true means that's a credit and false means that's a debit. And within our constructor we'll assign the values that are being passed as arguments to our private variables. So our underscore name will equal the name, our underscore amount will equal the amount, our underscore credit will obviously equal the credit, and finally the date will equal the date. Now I have this named as DT instead of date because if I type date, you can see that's a keyword. Alright, so this is our constructor. And last thing, for our transaction class, we will be able to return the formatted output. So I'll create a function, I'll call it format, and it will return the string of the formatted output. So within the function, we will put information into the proper form for insertion into one of the two text files. So basically it will be formatted for writing into a text file Remember, the format is the date, the type of transaction, amount, and then the credit. So we will return, and everything will be obviously returned as string. So we will return the transaction date dot to string. Then we will concatenate the comma right after it without any spaces. Then we will concatenate the name of the account, which is a string, so we don't have to format that any further. Then comma. Then is the amount, which is a double, so we'll need to format it string again. And finally, the credit. And I'll format it to string since it's a boolean. And this is the transaction class, all that we need. Next, let's work on the account class. So the first thing, we need to have an array of the transactions. We could probably have a list because we obviously will be adding transactions to it all the time. But for our purposes, I'm just going to create an array and limit it to 50 transactions at most. And it's going to be the type of transaction. The next, I'm going to create an integer which will hold the value of the last transaction stored. That's going to be basically like the index of the last transactions. Again, because we don't know where we are going to be within our transactions array, that will keep track of that. And I'm going to create two private variables, which is going to be the name of the account and the balance. And these will be private, and then we will have properties that will be public from which we can retrieve the information. So let's create those two properties for the name and balance, and they can be read-only because we only want to retrieve the information, or we want to make the retrieval information available publicly and setting the information privately from different parts of the program. Alright, so for our name, we will do the getter, and we will get the actual name from the variable. And in our balance, we will return the underscore balance variable. Now I'm going to create a public event, because remember, we're supposed to have an event for the insufficient funds and also information when the transaction is committed. So the first event will be the insufficient, and it will take the amount that is we are over the limit. So I will just pass the over as a double to it. And the next one is the transaction committed, and that one doesn't take any arguments at all. Alright, so the next will create some sub-procedures. The first one will be the one that will set the name, and we will store the name of the account. Alright, the next, we can create constructors for the name. So since we have the read-only property, we have to set the name within our constructor. So we are setting the name that is being passed to it, and the name will be passed into our name variable. So our name will equal the name that is passed as the argument into this constructor. Alright, the next sub-procedure, we will be adding the transactions. So I'll create a sub-procedure, I'll call it add, and it will expect the actual transaction to be passed as the argument. So it's the type of transaction, and we will be adding the transaction to the account. So I'll create a variable, I'll call it new balance, and now I can calculate the new balance. Now to calculate the new balance, we need to know whether the transaction is a credit or debit. In other words, whether we are putting money in or taking money out. So I will do an if statement to calculate the new balance. And if the transaction is credit, then our new balance will equal the balance property. In other words, that's the balance that was already there, plus the transaction amount. So we are adding money in. Else, we are taking money out, so our new balance will equal the balance minus the transaction amount. So now we have to make sure that the balance is not negative, because if it is, then we have to raise the event for the insufficient funds. So we'll basically check if the new balance is greater than 0, or in our case, let's check if the new balance is less than a 0. Because if it is, we can raise the event, that is the insufficient fund event, and we are passing the new balance, which will display how much it is over the limit. However, if we are within our limits, then we can add this to our transactions. So our last transaction number will be increased by 1, that's the counter. And now to ensure that there is space to store the transaction within the array, we have to make sure that the count is not over the 50. So we'll simply check if the count for the transaction, so the transaction.count, that's our array, minus 1 is less or equal to whatever the last transaction number was. So if the last transaction number was 50, that would be our last possible transaction. If it was 51, then this would return false, meaning that we would not be able to add this transaction anymore. But if it is less or equal to, then we can redeem our transaction array and add this transaction to it. And we of course have to preserve whatever was already in our array. so our transaction array, and we will add a new upper bound to our transactions array, so that's going to be the last number plus 1. Alright, so now we can store the transaction and the new balance and raise that the transaction was committed, so we'll raise the event for that. So our transaction array with the index of the last number will equal whatever the transaction we just committed. And our balance will now equal the new balance. We can add that to it now. And finally, now we can raise the event that the transaction was committed. So this is our add subprocedure, and last we will create a subprocedure to load the data from the comma separated text files. So I will create the file name first, and that will equal the name of the account, which is in our case checking and savings. So I'll simply do that, the name, and concatenate the .txt to it. So that will equal to either savings.txt or checking.txt. So this way I can use this subprocedure for both of these files and don't have to have a separate file for each of them. So next we need to create our stream reader, and now I create the array that will receive the values of the split function. So basically one line at a time. And finally I'll create the actual transaction file. It's going to be transaction as transaction. So now I can go and load the account if file actually exists. So we will do an if statement and we'll check if the io.file exists, and if it exists we can open it for reading. So our stream reader will equal the io.file.openText, and we are opening again the file name. So now we'll loop through all the lines of the file, and we'll loop until we encounter the end of the file. So we'll do a while not the stream reader dot end of stream, then we'll keep looping and splitting it. So we will assign the line to our line array, so our line will equal whatever we read and split it by the comma. So we'll read the line and then use this dot split to split it by the comma character. Now we have an array with all these values separated, the value for the date, name, amount, and credit. So now we can add the transaction to the actual account. So our transaction will equal, and we have a new transaction, so we will create new transaction, and we will pass what we just split from our line. So we will pass the line with the index of 0, which is the date, then we will pass the name, which is the index of 1 in our line, then the amount, index of 2, and finally we'll pass the index of 3, which is the credit. Now the transaction for the date we need to convert to date because that's the type of the variable that we need. So before the line with the index of 0 I'll type cdate. The name is a string, so that's correct, but the amount is double, so I'll convert that to double, and the line 3 with the index of 3 is the boolean, so I'll convert that to a boolean. So we have a new object of transaction, and now we can use our add method or subprocedure to add the transaction. So we'll simply call add subprocedure and pass the transaction to it. And at the end, once we are done with the file, we'll close it, so I will do sr.close. And that is our account class. And now let's put our classes to a good use. So I'll go to my form, I'll double click it, and I'll create some form level variables. The first, remember we have two events, so I have to create with events, and we have two checking and savings accounts, so I'll create one with events for each. And I'll create the new instance of the account. So since this is a check-in, I will pass the word check-in to it. It asks for the name as a string. And similarly, I'll do the savings, except I will pass the savings to it. Next, I'll create some variables. The first will be a boolean, and it will be true if the current mode is check-in, and false if it's savings. So I'll just call it check-in, because if it's not check-in, then it's savings. So we only need one, so check-in as boolean. And like I said, it will be true if the current mode is check-in. The next, I'll create another boolean for committed, and that will be true if the transaction was committed. And I will create a date variable for the current date. And the next, I'll create a structure of transactions. Alright, so here's my structure of transactions. I have the date, I have the transaction type, which is credit or debit. I have the new balance, which is calculated after each transaction. I have the amount of transaction and the credit or debit. Now the new balance, it's just like in your bank statement. After each transaction, you are presented with a new balance amount. So if you deposit $100 and your previous balance was $1,000, then new balance will obviously be $1,100. So for example, if you look over here, we deposit $1,000 at the beginning, and then we'll transfer $200, meaning our new balance after this second transaction would be $800, 1,000 minus 200. Then another check was cashed for $75, so we'll deduct $75 from 800 to get 725, so that would be the new balance after the third transactions, and so forth. So now I'm going to create an array of this transaction structure. And it's going to be blank because we don't know how many transactions there were actually done for any of these accounts yet. Later on we will have to redeem, figure out how many transactions are going to be placed into this array. So now I can go to my load event for the form, and I can set up the interface for check-in by default and then load the transactions from the data files. In other words, I will load all the transactions for both check-in and savings, but the form will be presented for check-in by default. So I will use the load method from our check-in and the same for the savings. However, I will select the check-in account as the default account, meaning that in our combo boxes there's two possible accounts, check-in and savings, and the check-in would have the index of 0 and savings would have index of 1. So I will use the selected index that equals to 0, which corresponds with the check-in. So my combo box for the transfer, remember there's a transfer from, in our case it would be saying transfer from check-in to savings by default, because the selected index will set to 0. So it by default will say over here, if you look at the form, so over here it would say transfer from check-in to savings, and here we would enter the amount to transfer. And similarly, we'll do the same for the account. Again, if you look over here, by default we will select the check-in account. So our combo box account.selected index will again equal to 0. Another thing we need to do when the form loads is to display today's date. So here's the text box for it. So I will simply do the txt date.text and set the date to today. So this is in a form of date, so I will have to convert it to string. And now after this, I can now display the transactions in our grid view over here. And for that, I'm going to create a sub-procedure that I will call upgrade grid, but I'll call it from our load event as well. So it's red because we didn't create it yet, so let's do that. And over here, I'm going to create a variable, which is going to be an array of strings, and that will read the file or all the lines from checkin.txt or savings.txt. Because remember, we will have to split each line by the comma later. So we will do an if statement and find out what account we are going to be reading from. So if our CBO, which is the combo box account dot selected index, if it equals 0, then we have a check-in account selected. And we can read all lines to our temp file, and we are reading it from the checkin.txt. Otherwise, we have the savings account selected, so we'll read from the savings.txt. So now we can take care of our transaction array of transactions, because now we will know how many transactions there are, because that's going to be the count of our temp array. So I'm going to create a variable for that. I'll just call it n, and that will equal the temp.count minus 1. So this is our latest or last index on that array. Next, I have to prepare for the slicing of our file by comma, so I'll create another array, call it line, and that one will be used to hold the information from each line, or one line at a time. So now I can finally dim our transaction array and pass the n as the upper bound index. Next, we can start splitting the file. So we already know which one we're reading. They both have the same structure, so we can do a for loop, and we are going to loop until we hit the last index, which is the n. And here I'm going to need to remember what the previous balance was in order to add to it the amount of transaction to create the new balance. So I'll create a variable of double, I'll call it previous balance. And now I can assign the split data from a temporary array to a line array. So a line will equal the temp array of index of I, which holds all the information from the file that we just read, dot split, and we are splitting it by the comma character. So now we have the data split and can assign it to our transaction array. So the TRS with the index of I, and the first is the date, which is the DT, and that will of course equal the first index in our line. So we will do cDate to convert the string to a date, and we will read the line with the index of 0 because that's the first index and that one holds the date. The next index holds the transaction type. So our transaction with the index of I dot transaction type will equal line with the index of 1. We don't have to convert it to anything because it's by default string. Next, we'll have the amount is in our line with the index of 2, and our amount in our transaction array of the structures will equal double conversion to our line with the index of 2. So now let's create our previous balance, or let's calculate it. Remember, the first thing in our file, the first transaction in both the checking and savings, there is no previous balance. This is the original balance. So first what we do is check if I equals 0, because that is our first transaction and that doesn't have the previous balance, and therefore we will set the previous balance simply to 0. There was nothing before that. Otherwise, if we are past the first transaction, we will add that to our previous balance. So our previous balance will equal the transaction with the index of I, and that's the new balance of it. So at this point we don't actually have the new balance calculated because we are at the basically the index of I equals 0. But if we are on the second iteration, then we will have the new balance, and to calculate that we need to first figure out whether the transaction was credit or debit. So we'll do an if statement and we'll convert it to a boolean. What we are converting is the line with the index of 3. That one holds the data for credit or debit. So if this is true, then it's a credit and we add the amount of the transaction to our previous balance to create the new balance. So our transaction with the index of I, and that's the new balance, will equal previous balance. So at the beginning it was 0, and then we'll add the amount to it of this transaction. If this is false, then we have a debit and we will deduct the transaction amount from our previous balance to create our new balance. So it's the same thing except it says minus. So as we loop, this new balance will be calculated for each of the transactions except of the first one because that's the original one, and after that we can now create a query that will return all the information we need and then display it into a grid view. So we are creating the transaction array of structures, and let's create a formatted output. So I'll create a variable for the amount, and it will equal the actual amount but convert it to string and format it to currency. And similarly I'll do the same for the new balance. And at the end I can select the date, that they didn't have to be formatted, they can be taken as is, transaction type, which again doesn't have to be formatted, and then the amount, which we have the variable for, formatted to currency, and the new balance. And this will be displayed in our grid view. So to do that, I will set the data source to query.toList for our grid view of transactions. So I have my data source, and now I want to change the headers, because if I just leave it as is, then the headers will be set as DT or TRS type, EMT, and new bal. So I'll just want to display something more English-like. So the first column, which is the DT column, the header text for it will read date. The next column, which is the transaction type, that header text will read type of transaction. And the next one will read amount and new balance. Alright, so this is in our update grid that we called from the load. The next, let's do the events for the insufficient and for the committed. So I'll create a sub-procedure for those. So here is my sub-procedure. We'll pass the over as double, that's the argument, and it handles the insufficient funds event for our check-in and also insufficient funds for our savings. So if there are insufficient funds, we will set the committed flag to false and display a message because we don't want to process the transaction. So our committed will equal false and will display a message box saying that that's insufficient funds. And similarly, I'll handle the event for the committed. So here's my event for committed transactions, and once again it handles the check-in.transaction committed or savings.transaction committed. And here, if the transaction is committed, we will set the committed flag to true, and that's all we'll do. Alright, let's move on. The next, we will go to our form and we will do the account and double click that. And when we change the account, we want to switch obviously from whatever it was before. If it was check-in, we want to switch it to savings or vice versa. So let's show the check group box if check-in is enabled. Now remember, at the beginning we declared a variable that we called check, which is true if current mode is check-in. And the current mode is check-in if the selected index from the combo box is 0. So we can check for the true of that statement. So our check will equal CBO account dot selected index equals 0. In other words, we check in if this is true, and if it is, then it's going to be check-in. If it is false, then it will be the savings. Again, remember, our check it is true if the current mode is check-in, and obviously false if it is not check-in, meaning that it's savings. So this will be basically true or false, and now we can make true or false for our group of check. If you go to our design, in our check, we want to hide it when this is savings. So now check will now equal true or false, and we will assign that value to our group check. So we will do group check.visible equals the check, because check now holds the value true if it's check-in or false if it is not check-in. So we will either display it or not. And after that, we can display the transaction for the account and upgrade the grid. So I'm going to call the upgrade the grid, but before that I need to create a sub-procedure. I'll call it display, and I'll call it right now. And after that, the upgrade grid. Update grid we already created. So now let's create the display sub-procedure, and we will display the transactions that belong to the account. So again, we will see if check equals true or false. In other words, if check-in is selected or not. So if check, in other words, if true for the check-in, and if this is the check-in, then we will display the check-in balance in the text box. So our txt balance and the text will equal, since this is check-in, we will do the check-in balance. And this is obviously a double, so we'll convert it to string and format it to currency. Else, in other words, if this is savings, then we will display the savings balance and convert it to string and format it to currency. And at the end, once again, we need to update the grid. Alright, so let's move on again. The next one will be the button click event for the deposit. So I'll double click that. And if I deposit in the money, we'll simply deposit the amount into the account. So I will create a transaction variable, and I will create the new deposit for the transaction. So I will have the current date, which I will take from the text box for the date and format it to a date. So now I can create the actual transaction. So my new object of transaction, and we will pass the current date. We will pass the deposit to it as a string, because this is the deposit button click event. We will pass the amount, which is coming from the txt deposit text box over here. So I will simply convert the value that is in the text box to a double. And since this is a credit, I will pass true to it. We are adding money to the account. Now I need to store the transaction and, of course, update the display. So once again, we will do an if statement and see if it's check-in. So if it's check, then we'll proceed with the check-in. And we will do the check-in.add, and we are adding the transaction that we created the object of. So now I'm going to write the transaction to the file. So I'll create a stream writer, and it will simply equal the io.file. And we already have the file, so I will need to append it. So I will do append text, and it will append the text to the end of the file because this is our latest transaction. And this is a check-in, so we will pass the checking.txt. That's our file. Next, I will write the line itself. This is just creating our or opening our stream writer. Now I will do sw.write the line, and I'm writing. Remember, in our transaction, we have this format that already puts everything with the commas. So I will simply call this sub-procedure, and it will give us the formatted output to write into the file. So trans.format. And at the end, I need to close the file for writing. So sw.close. Else, it's going to be the same way, except this is going to write into savings. So again, we are adding the transaction to our savings, creating the stream writer with our savings.txt and opening it for append. Then we will write the line, which calls the transaction.format, and close the file. And at the end, after the if statement, we will display the new transaction. So we'll call the display, and at the end we can clear the text box that we entered the deposit amount to. Now let's do the withdrawal, and it's going to be very similar. So let me just actually copy paste this whole thing. So this won't be deposit amount, this will be withdrawing. But we create our transaction, we create our date, we create our transaction object, but it won't be deposit, we'll change it to withdrawal. And it won't be from txt deposit, because this is from txt withdrawal.text. And of course, since this is withdrawal, true becomes false, because this is a debit operation. But we'll store the transaction and update the display the same. We'll see if it's a checking account. We will add the transaction to our checkin.add, and here we need to do a little bit differently. We need to see if the transaction was committed. Remember, if when we are withdrawing, we need to check whether we are over the limit. So we will simply say if committed, in other words, if committed is true and everything is okay, then we can write the file. So I'll just copy paste that within our if statement here. So if transaction is committed, we will open the stream writer, write the line, and close the stream writer. If this is savings, then we will add the transaction to our savings, and just like before, we need to see if the transaction was committed. So once again, I will just place these 3 lines within our if statement. After that, we will display the new transaction, and in our txt withdrawal, we will clear the amount that was entered there. So like I said, this is very similar, except we have to check whether we didn't try to withdraw more than was in our account. Next, let's do this sign checking account, and here basically we are writing a check that will clear. So that's basically a debit operation, or in other words, withdrawal from our account. So once again, I'm going to borrow all of this from our withdrawal click event and just make a few changes to it. So it is a withdrawal, we need the transaction, we need the current date, we need the transaction object. The only thing here is we can pass a different than withdrawal. What we can pass is that it's a check being cashed by, and here, if you see in our check group box, that is the order of. This is where you write the name for whom the check is. So we can add that to this string. So I will concatenate that as txt check2, or who is it addressed to, .text. So this is our type of transaction, and the amount comes from not withdrawal text box, but txt check, which is this text box here. And false remains because this is a withdrawal. Now we don't have to check if this is all check-in, because it is by default check-in. We are writing a check. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually delete these if statements here, and I'm just going to add the transaction to our check-in directly. I don't have, like I said, we don't have to worry whether it's savings because it's not. So our checkin.add, and we are adding the transaction. And since this is a withdrawal in a way, so we need to again check if it's committed. And if it is, then again we will append the stream writer, we will write the line, and then we will close the stream writer. And we are, of course, since this is check-in, writing into our checkin.txt. At the end, I will display the new transaction, and here I'm going to clear the 2 text boxes for the pay to this amount to and what the amount is. The checkboxes are txt check.clear, and the next one is txt check2.clear. So now let's go to our design again and double click the drop down here, because remember that has the transfer from check-in or transfer from savings. So I'll double click that, and here we will once again check if the selected index is 0. And if it is, then we are transferring from check-in to savings. So our label, which is the label transfer to .text, will equal to savings. Now if I go to the design, this is the label that we are changing. Right now it just says to, but it will now say to savings. If it's not to savings, then it will say to check-in. So else it will equal to check-in. Simple enough. And there's one more thing to do, and that is the transfer. So I'll double click that. And here we will transfer the money from one account to another. So again, I will create a transaction variable and an amount variable, which will be the value from the text box of the transfer, so I'll convert it to double. And we will check for the current date. Basically, we're just assigning the current date from the txt date.text and converting it to date. Alright, the next we'll have to see if we are transferring from checking or from savings. So we'll do an if statement and see if the CBO transfer dot selected index equals 0, which is the check-in, and if it is, we are transferring from check-in to savings. So now we can store the transaction from the checking account, and I can create object of transaction and pass the current date, and the transaction name we can say transfer to savings. We can pass the amount, and we can pass false because this is obviously a debit, in other words taking money from the checking account. Now we can add the transaction to our check-in just like we did before and check if committed came back as true. And if it did, now we can write the transaction into our checking account just like we did before. So we have our stream writer, our checking account, and writing the line into it. Now we'll go over here and do an else statement which takes care of the transactions from savings account. And I'm going to pretty much borrow everything from here and the if statement as well, because we will create the object of transaction, except this will say transfer to check-in. The amount and false stays because again we are taking money from the savings this time. So this is gonna add the savings transaction. And once again, if committed, we will write, but we are writing to savings account or the savings file. So this took care of transferring to, but now we also need value to the other account that will read transfer from. So when we have a transfer to savings, that's going to be the information in our checkin.txt, and the corresponding information will be transfer from checkin in our savings.txt. So we do another if statement, and we will deposit the other account only if the last transaction was committed. So I'm going to do an if committed, then we can proceed. And what we're gonna do is basically simulate the whole thing that we have here. So we will check if the transfer is coming from the checking account, and if it is, then the transaction will be written to our savings account because money came from checking into savings. So once again, I will create a transaction object and pass the date, and the information will read transfer from check-in, and it's gonna be amount, and it will be true because that is a credit operation. We are adding money to our savings from check-in. Then we can send the transaction to our add method for savings, and finally write everything into our savings.txt. So this is when we are transferring from check-in, but another option obviously is to transfer from savings, and it's gonna be the same. So I'm going to store the transaction to check-in this time because it's coming from savings. I'll create the object and it will read transfer from savings. It's gonna be amount and true because we are adding money to our check-in. So we'll add the transaction to check-in and write everything into our checkin.txt. Then, still within our if committed clause, we will simply display the transaction and clear the transfer text box. And this should be all we needed. So let's test it out. Alright, so here's my form. You can see my balance and today's date, and in the grid view you can see all the transactions. First, let's try to withdraw $1,300, which is more than what we have. So I get the insufficient funds, click OK. Oh, but it still processed it. It just gave me a negative. I'm going into a minus $187. So something's off. Let me just close that and find out what's wrong. And here's the problem. These three lines are out of our if statement here. Remember, we are checking if the balance is less than 0, and then we raise the insufficient funds. Otherwise, we will go ahead and process it. However, these three lines are after the if statement, so they are processed every time, and the transaction committed is set to true even if there are insufficient funds. So all I have to do is copy them and paste them still within our end if block. Alright, there's one more thing that I actually noticed. If you go to our form, we have the new balance, that is the balance after each transaction. So we take the previous balance and add the amount to it. And here, if we have the original balance, which is the first line of the file, then we'll set it to 0. Otherwise, our previous balance, we have the transaction of I and the new balance and assign it to our previous balance. But it's not. This is the new balance. This is what we have now. That's basically the amount. We are assigning it to our previous balance, so it has to be I minus 1. So that was another bug I noticed. Alright, so let's run it. Alright, so first let's try to withdraw again $1,300, and I get the insufficient funds. I'll click OK, and you can see that it was not processed. So now let's deposit $100, and if I scroll down, you can see the transaction has a deposit of $100 and our new balance, and the balance is also in our text box here. So now let's do transfer from checking to savings. Let's transfer $212.50, which should leave us $1,000 balance. And you can see it did, and here's our transfer to savings. So now let's write a check. Let's say $50 to Pavel. I'll click sign check. Our balance changes to $950, and here's my cash or check cashed by Pavel, $50, and new balance is $950. So let's try one more withdrawal. Let's say $50, and now we have $900, and here's my withdrawal. So checking seems to be working correctly. Alright, so let's try savings. I'll change it to savings, and you can see we have 4 transactions, which includes the transfer from checking that I just did. So let's try withdraw more than what we have, and I get the insufficient funds, and nothing happens. The transaction is not committed. So now let's deposit $100 to our savings, and you can see that it's been deposited. And you can also see that the check writing group box is gone when we have savings selected. So now let's transfer from savings to checking, and let's transfer $13.50, and you can see it's $1,100 there, and here's our transfer to checking. So if you go to checking, our last transaction should be transfer from savings, $13.50. So that's working correctly as well, and you can see that when we're in checking, the check group box appears again. So this all seems to be working fine. Let me just try to actually withdraw something that we have in savings to verify that, and we have $100 withdrawal. That's correct. So this is the bank account exercise. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.